Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would give my take, my fight breakdown, my fight analysis, and of course, my fight review of the Saul Canelo Alvarez versus Jaime Munguia fight that, of course, recently just ended up happening. And of course, for those of you that did not hear about the results, Mr. Canelo Alvarez, Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, was once again able to come out victorious, and I believe that he was able to win by that of a unanimous decision. I ended up personally scoring the fight, I believe, about 9 rounds to 3. You could maybe even debate that it was 10 rounds to 2 for Canelo Alvarez, but I think that Canelo personally won about 10. Excuse me, I thought he won about 9 rounds to 3. I thought Jaime Munguia, I thought that he started off somewhat well, but Jaime Munguia, in my view, and I kind of predicted this, Jaime Munguia gets a little bit too wild. He's not always the most defensively responsible. And on top of that, he's also not the quickest puncher. He's not the slowest puncher overall that I've ever seen, but Canelo has been in there with faster. And even Canelo Alvarez kind of said after the fight that he was a bit slow, that I could pretty much see every punch that was coming. And Jaime Munguia, he did land a couple of flush punches against Canelo, even a couple of punches that really made Canelo, say, wow. Like, this kid overall can really punch. And let me tell you what, also kudos to Canelo for beating someone of Jaime Munguia's size, because not only is Jaime Munguia, in my view, an A-minus level fighter, but Jaime Munguia, like, that dude at a fucking minimum is a super middleweight. Like, I don't know how that dude ever used to make 154 pounds. Like, that dude is a Goliath overall, even for the 160-pound weight class. I really don't even know how he made 154. I guess overall because he was probably so young at the time. But he's at the very least a 168 pounder. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So I do give Canelo Alvarez a great amount of credit. And in my view, this would count as another A grade win. Just probably a A-minus level win. Probably a A-minus level win. I wouldn't say that Jaime, in my view, is anything above that. But Jaime, in my view, he's a talented fighter, but he just fought the completely wrong fight. And I'm going to talk about the breakdown of the fight, and why I believe that Jaime lost so badly, and what Canelo Alvarez was doing correct, maybe certain things that both fighters are doing correct and wrong. And then afterwards, of course, I'll mention the David Benavidez fight and what is in the future for both of these fighters, because, of course, the David Benavidez fight was mentioned, and, Canelo Alvarez, he sounded overall, not quite as interested in that fight, kind of like usual. But to be honest with you, I don't really blame Canelo Alvarez, because if he takes that fight, Benavidez obviously is going to get more out of that fight than what Canelo Alvarez is, at least potentially. And I think he realizes that whether he wins or loses that fight, that's a fight that would just do a lot of damage. And I think that if you get in the ring with David Benavidez, even if Canelo ends up beating him, it's going to be a war, in my opinion. And on top of that, it would pretty much spell the end of Canelo Alvarez, even if he ends up winning that fight, because he would never be the same. There are just certain fighters, especially at a certain age, to where when you fight overall a certain fight, it pretty much takes years off of your career. And that's why Terrence Bud Crawford right now, he's not really hot on fighting Jerome Boots Ennis, because I don't think Crawford is scared of him necessarily. But, Crawford takes a look at Jerome Boots Ennis and he said, this dude is severely talented. He's a lot younger than me. And on top of that, there are certain things that I still want to accomplish in my career that I can do a little bit more. I already proved everything at the welterweight class. I want to move up to 154, maybe even a little bit higher to fight that of Canelo Alvarez. We'll see overall what ends up happening. I think that's what Crawford basically is stating. So he says, if I'm fighting Jerome Boots Ennis, there better be like a major payday and all sort of stuff. So that's why Crawford kind of said that was a lose-lose situation. Because I don't I don't think that he looks at Jerome Boots Ennis as a fight that he really wants. And I think that Canelo kind of thinks somewhat similarly about David Benavidez, but we'll see overall, where that goes. But anyways, just to talk about the fight, overall, what do I believe Jaime Munguia ended up doing wrong within the fight? I was a little bit confused as to why Jaime Munguia really was standing inside the range with Canelo Alvarez a little bit too often. Now, he was doing good, in my view, within the first few rounds, because, he kind of overall had fought Canelo Alvarez, to the point where he was pushing him back a little bit. And, in my view, that's a good thing to do against Canelo, because he's a guy to where he can fight pretty much well in every range, but sometimes because his feet can be a little bit clunky, overall, at least in certain times, or at least a little bit slow, he's not always the greatest at fighting on the back foot, at least not as great as, say, like a Mayweather or a Crawford or something like that. But Canelo fought pretty well on the back foot even when he needed to here. I've seen him better on the back foot in other fights, like against Danny Jacobs and, maybe some other guys as well. But you could tell that Canelo Alvarez also, in my view, that he just, he looked overall really old within this fight. And I still thought that he was relatively dominant within this fight, but Canelo looked like he was about 40 years old in there. Like, Canelo looked so slow compared to his old self, in my view. But because of his greatness and his accuracy and his defense and his head movement and his slips and his parries and his feints, Canelo Alvarez, of course, he can still beat the majority of even A-grade level fighters around him. But we'll get into that a little bit more as the video goes along. But anyways, Jaime Munguia, in my view, I thought that he was doing okay, within the first 3 rounds. I thought that he won the first round, and I also thought that he won the third round. But once that knockdown happened, it pretty much completely changed the flow of things. But I really don't know why Jaime Munguia was that close, and especially leaning right into Canelo Alvarez's range and making himself smaller. I don't really overall know why he would do that against Canelo Alvarez, someone that is going to have the advantage within that range, because, I mean, sometimes making yourself bigger, it can maybe be a disadvantage, and of course, smaller, guys, they're they can be harder to hit because they are a smaller target than you. But like Jaime Munguia was just like, as you see in that picture there, when Canelo Alvarez is hitting him with the left hook there, Jaime Munguia was leaning forward, through a lot of those exchanges. And I was a little bit confused because I really don't know what he was really trying to go for. I think that maybe he was waiting for Canelo to hit him and then try to hit him with the left hook over the top, maybe kind of like what Gennady Golovkin once upon a time did. But you're not going to get Canelo Alvarez like that. He's way too intelligent. He's, he used to be pretty darn fast, but he's still, he's still fast enough overall for Jaime Munguia. And once again, his hand speed really wasn't there, at least nowhere near what he used to be. But Canelo Alvarez is just so disciplined, and he's pretty much been in there with it all. So you could tell that he pretty much, mainly knew the combinations and the punches that Jaime Munguia was going to throw. And of course, after that knockdown, and once he really started feeling Canelo Alvarez's power, he started getting discouraged a little bit. And Canelo Alvarez's jab, I thought, was very crisp throughout the whole entire fight. If there was one complaint that I would say about Canelo, I would state overall that, in my view, he could use his right hand a little bit more sometimes, especially at this point in time in his career. There's a little bit too much wind up. But, Canelo Alvarez, I think, still, did a good enough job within this fight. And, of course, it was enough to clearly win over a decently talented fighter and a guy that probably was at least 10 to 15 pounds bigger than him potentially. I mean, damn, I don't know how big he was on this fight night, but Jaime Munguia did not look like a middleweight fighter. He looked like a super middleweight to borderline light heavyweight fighter. This kid was huge. But anyways, when it comes down to it, I just think that Jaime fought the complete wrong fight. I think that Jaime really went behind his jab, overall tried to, counter Canelo Alvarez a little bit more, really tried to, throw some feints in there, stuck more in the mid-range and then using angles. In my view, to beat Canelo Alvarez, you really have to try to use your feet, because if you're a fighter that is just going to plod forward, you're not going to beat Canelo Alvarez that way. Now, David Benavidez, he's a guy that I think could potentially beat Canelo Alvarez, but that's partially because Canelo Alvarez, in my view, he doesn't really look at his peak anymore. And I think that he looks more aged with every fight that I watch him. And on top of that, David Benavidez is like, David Benavidez could easily fight at the cruiserweight division. Like, he's at the very least 2, if not even more weight classes bigger than that of a Canelo Alvarez. So, that's pretty much the only reason why I would basically state that, and of course he's talented, but, quite the fighter that Canelo is? No, not quite, but we'll get into that fight a little bit later. But Jaime Munguia, in my view, he just didn't use his feet anywhere near enough. I thought that he was staying within Canelo Alvarez's range way too long. He wasn't moving enough, and kind of like how I had predicted, Jaime Munguia, he's not a bad fighter, but you can tell that he's a little bit technically flawed. And even Jaime Munguia after the fight stated that Canelo Alvarez is more experienced, and I agree. Once again, people will take a look at it and they'll state that, oh, well, that's just an excuse because Jaime Munguia is 43-0, right? But, when it comes overall to certain experiences, like, sometimes you'll see a young bull or a young lion within a sport, and you can tell that they end up losing overall to the guy who might even be a little bit aged, may not even be quite what they once were. But they can still beat them because overall, once again, they've been around there. They've been there and done that. They're, too experienced. Like if you take a look overall, I'm trying to think of examples. Like if you take a look at Stephen Curry when he won the championship in 2022, Steph, of course, was still at a great point in his career, but the rest of that team really was old. Draymond Green, he really was, I'm not going to say a non-factor, but he was almost as close to a non-factor as possible. Klay Thompson still had an effect, but he clearly was old. He was no longer the same player, nowhere near, nowhere near as good defensively as what he once was. Andrew Wiggins really was the second most valuable player on that team throughout that series. Boston had all the young talent. They had all the opportunity in the world, but because Steph Curry, overall, because he was the greatest player in that series, the best player in that series, and the most skilled and talented player within that series, and because he was more experienced. That, I'm not going to say alone, but, that overall was a big part as to why he ended up winning that championship. Novak Djokovic, when he's beat Carlos Alcaraz, overall at certain times, you can tell that Carlos, is getting to the point where he's at his absolute peak. It's getting there. But Djokovic was able to beat him a couple times because, once again, he's been there and done that. And Djokovic is very shrewd. He's very smart. It's the same thing about Canelo Alvarez. Very intelligent fighter. I just think that Jaime Munguia, once again, fought the complete wrong fight. I think that, once again, that he should have used his feet more. He should have used a lot more lateral movement. I think that he tried to brawl a little bit too much with Canelo Alvarez, which is pretty much what I assumed. I was a little bit surprised, I will say, however, that Canelo Alvarez was backed up a little bit more throughout this fight. But to be quite honest with you, I wasn't really surprised when I seen it kind of in the first couple of rounds, because I didn't expect Jaime Munguia to be that big. I didn't watch the weigh-ins. I didn't watch overall the press conferences. I knew that Jaime Munguia was a big dude. I did not know he was that that big, at least compared to Canelo Alvarez. Maybe not quite as big as, say, as like what a Callum Smith was, but to be honest with you, he was really around there. This is probably the biggest opponent that Canelo Alvarez has fought since that of a Callum Smith or of course, a Dimitri Bivol. Probably the biggest opponent that he's fought since a Dimitri Bivol. So overall, definitely, a good, sharp performance by Canelo Alvarez. But like I stated, Canelo, his counters were very great. He was working off of his jab, but you can tell that Canelo Alvarez is severely aging as a fighter. His stamina, and he's always had stamina issues, but his stamina is even a little bit less than what it once was throughout a lot of this fight. He didn't throw as much, in my view, as what he could have. He's not quite as quick to the punch, which means that his counter-punching ability, although still very great, is not going to be quite as sharp as what it once was. It's not going to be quite as crisp as what it once was, because he can't get to the punch, or, he can't get, overall to the face or wherever he's trying to hit quite as quick. So Canelo, he's still great with his pull counters. He's still great with his rolls, and, overall with the way that he fights, he's still great, but you can tell that he's no longer at his peak. He's no longer the Canelo that I seen against Gennady Golovkin or Miguel Cotto or Danny Jacobs or Caleb Plant. He's no longer the fighter of that ilk. Canelo right now is the older lion, and it's going to be very soon that Canelo Alvarez, is going to get knocked off very soon. Of course, it wasn't Jaime Munguia, but it is what it is. And let me also state this. It's going to get to the point also where Canelo, to where, unless, unless he dominates some of these fights, it's clearly kind of like is what he did here. There might be a possibility that Canelo Alvarez ends up losing one of these fights in a fight that he may potentially, overall deserve to win. But Canelo was not quite the same golden boy as what he once was anymore. Because one of the scorecards, I believe, was 117 to like 114 in this fight, or 115, whatever it was, or excuse me, not that, 115, I believe, to 112, which would have meant that Jaime Munguia won 5 rounds in this fight. And if you're an actual competent judge or scorer, I have no actual idea how you give Jaime Munguia 5 rounds within this fight. I think that you give him 3, maybe 4, and that's really if you were paid off, in my view, slightly about Jaime Munguia, or if you were a Jaime Munguia fan. But Canelo, in my view, won this fight at the very least easily 9 rounds to 3. I just thought that his counterpunching ability was way too good. His defense was just way too good, and Jaime Munguia will give you certain openings, So it is what it is. But as for Canelo Alvarez, where does he go from here? I'll first talk about Jaime Munguia, I suppose, because Canelo, of course, he probably, is going to be the bigger news. But Jaime Munguia, as for now, I don't really know where he goes, but I would love to see Jaime Munguia maybe in certain fights, like against that, overall of a Caleb Plant, potentially, if he can make that fight. I would love to see the fight, potentially against Charlo, if Canelo doesn't fight that, a Jamal Charlo, maybe even a Demetrius Andrade, a Janibek, any one of those fighters. I would personally love to see Jaime Munguia potentially fight any of those fighters to see overall, if maybe he can do a little bit better. But it might be best for Jaime Munguia right now, to kind of stand back, and see where he ends up going from here, and maybe to kind of face, I don't want to say a complete tune-up, but a fighter that, probably he's going to have an easier time in the ring with against, than what would be a Plant or some of these other guys. But I don't know. We'll see. Like, if he fought Andrade next, that might be a little bit too risky of a fight, just because Andrade, he can be very slippery, but that'd be an interesting fight to see, just, if Jaime Munguia would be able to do anything with Demetrius Andrade. That'd be very interesting. But, as for Jaime Munguia, we'll see overall what happens with him. Actually, a fight that I would love to see Jaime Munguia in next would be him versus Edgar Berlanga. I would personally love to see that fight. As for Canelo Alvarez, and there's been talks about him fighting Edgar Berlanga, but to be quite honest with you, I have no interest whatsoever in an Edgar Berlanga fight. I don't think that Edgar Berlanga is an elite level fighter. I think that he was a guy that is very hyped up, and he has shown overall that as of right now, he's not really living up to that hype. All right, it just is what it is. I would love to see Munguia versus Berlanga, but I would not like to see Canelo versus Berlanga. I believe that the two fights that I would really love to see Canelo Alvarez in next, of course, if he's not going to fight that at David Benavidez, Jamal Charlo would be interesting, but I really don't know how much more Jamal Charlo really has left. Of course, he's a lot, he's in terms of at least boxing years overall. I'll state, of course, Jamal Charlo, he may even be a little bit older than what Canelo Alvarez is, I believe. But at the end of the day, in terms of boxing years, in terms of wear and tear, Canelo Alvarez, is much more aged than what a Jamal Charlo is. But Jamal Charlo right now, he just appears completely mentally off the map. So I really don't know where he's going to be. But the fight, to be quite honest with you, other than David Benavidez that I would love to see Canelo Alvarez in, would actually be against that of that Kazakhstan fighter at 160, Yanibek. I would love to see that fight because that fighter, in my view, that fighter is a real threat from anyone to 160, maybe even a little bit potentially to 168. He's extremely talented. He's extremely fast. He's a guy overall that, I believe can box very well. He has great boxing ability. He's a great athlete. Now, do I see that fight probably ever happening? Probably not, because I don't know if Canelo Alvarez would see enough money in it. But to be honest with you, that would be a fight that I would love to see. I would absolutely love to see Canelo Alvarez versus Yanibek. I would love, 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 love to watch that fight, because that would be, in my view, a great fight. Yanibek, in my view, would have a better chance against Canelo than what a Jaime Munguia would for certain. But, we'd have to see. But as for the David Benavidez fight, if you're asking me after this performance, well, Mr. Boxing Realist, what do you think Canelo Alvarez's chances are of beating David Benavidez after this performance? And I would say that I would give Canelo Alvarez still a good chance because Canelo Alvarez is a great fighter. But to be quite honest with you, if that fight happened right now, I would probably favor David Benavidez 60-40 or 70-30. And it's not that I believe that Benavidez is the all-around better fighter than Canelo. It's not that I believe that he's more talented than Canelo or, more skilled than him. I don't believe that. But Benavidez is a decent amount bigger than Canelo Alvarez, overall. And on top of that, it's not, and people, of course, are going to compare it overall to, the Mayweather situation where they'll be like, oh, well, Canelo Alvarez, overall, he fought Mayweather at 36. Mayweather's able to do it. But also keep in mind that Mayweather, within his career, he sustained a lot overall of less damage at that point in time. And Canelo has, he's in his 19th year right now. Mayweather at that time, I don't really exactly remember what year it was. I mean, it was 2013. And of course, Floyd retired in 2015, I think anywhere from his 18th to 19th year. Maybe even his 20th. I don't know. But Floyd Mayweather Jr. was, he was about in his 16th year or 17th year of boxing. So he still overall had some peak years overall at that time. And Mayweather, by the way, also, Canelo, of course, was clearly bigger by about 20 pounds. But he also could compete with Canelo in terms of the reach. Canelo, in terms of physical advantages, other than maybe just raw punching power, I don't know if he's going to be able to compete with David Benavidez in any physical edge whatsoever. He's not going to be able to compete him with height. He's not going to be able to compete him with speed. He's not going to be able to compete him overall with size, with height, with weight. He's not going to be able to compete with him in anything. So Canelo would have to compete with him, in my view, with his raw boxing ability. And of course, I think that he has better boxing ability than that of David Benavidez, but he just looked way too slow for me in this fight. Canelo Alvarez, once again, he's still a great fighter, but he looked really slow to me in this fight. He looked probably the slowest that I had ever seen him. I thought that he had a very crisp jab, and at times, there was a little bit of speed there, but, Canelo, in my view, he no longer is that quick twitch fighter that once upon a time he was. And I'm not stating that Canelo was Sugar Ray Leonard or anything in terms of his hand speed, but Canelo at least was very, quick at one point in time. He had a good amount of pop and snap within his punches, and he still has great snap within his punches, but you can tell that that speed has severely slowed down. It has severely slowed down. And, a lot of people noticed it in the Dimitri Bivol fight at first. I thought that was just because Canelo Alvarez gained a little bit too much muscle mass and a little bit too much weight. But then ever since I saw the Gennady Golovkin trilogy fight, that's when I was really starting to wonder because Canelo looked older in that fight. And then against John Ryder, he looked like complete shit in my view. And then against Jamal Charlo, he looked really good. But I mean, anyone who really knows anything about boxing pretty much expected that because Jamal Charlo, is no offense against him, but in terms of a pound for pound fighter, in terms of skills, he was a bit overrated in my personal view. but it is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to it, the David Benavidez fight, it would be very particularly interesting, but I don't know if Canelo Alvarez, in my view, I'm not quite sure if he would win that fight, at least at this moment in his career. I think that if Canelo Alvarez, that had the fight happen maybe, 3, 4 years ago when Canelo was fighting guys like Plant and Danny Jacobs and guys like that, I probably would have slightly favored Canelo Alvarez just because I think that he would have had enough power to back David Benavidez up because that's what Canelo Alvarez is going to have to do. I don't know if he can beat David Benavidez by really trying to fight on the back foot. And it isn't that Canelo Alvarez is not a great fighter on the back foot, but, or at least overall that he can't fight a little bit on the back foot. But Benavidez is going to be a decent amount taller than him, and he's going to be lengthier than him. David Benavidez, even though he's not the most maneuverable, and at times his defense could be a bit better, he's still going to be hard to hit consistently, at least to the head, because, David Benavidez is like, what, 7 inches taller than Canelo Alvarez? So, like, at the end of the day, it's like, I just don't overall really know, what would happen, but I would probably predict, at least at this point, that Benavidez would beat Canelo Alvarez. And I definitely would not see him beating Dmitry Bivol in a rematch at this point in time, or that of Artur Beterbiev. I just don't think that, overall that he really has the same level of athleticism anymore. But we'll see what happens. But like I said, the fights that I would like to see Canelo Alvarez in, I would like to see him fight Janibek, maybe Jamal Charlo. And of course, the David Benavidez fight would be nice. But, Canelo Alvarez, of course, when he was asked about it, he said that, well, listen, I fought all these guys, and at the end of the day, I fought them all. So now at this point in time in my career, I can ask for anything that I want. And what that is Canelo Alvarez's roundabout way of stating is that I know that my time is coming to an end very soon. And that if I'm going to fight David Benavidez and overall have this ride, pretty much be ended, whether I win or lose that fight, because he's going to be a threat in terms of his size. And on top of that, in terms of what he can do in the boxing ring, his skills, combined with it all, you're going to have to very much reward me because we all know that fighting me is a reward in itself because I'm one of the faces of boxing, if not still the face of boxing. You're going to get a massive payday and you're going to get a great amount of credit because I'm remembered as one of the greater fighters. So there has to be something more in it for me if basically what you're going to be trying to do is end my career. And I think that's what Canelo Alvarez, that's why he's asking for such a big payday. And I don't really have a problem with that, because Canelo, in my view, he can still have a couple more great fights and then potentially fight David Benavidez. But we'll see. I just don't see Canelo Alvarez fighting David Benavidez this September. He doesn't seem super interested in it unless he knows that it's going to be the final bout in his career. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. We'll see what ends up happening. But, cool would I like to see Canelo fight next? To be honest with you, I'd like to see him fight Janibek, or a good version of Jamal Charlo. But I don't know if Charlo's really going to be quite the same fighter, but we'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see where this goes.